Okay, so welcome. Thank you so much for attending today. Hopefully I'll have a chance to have some discussion and questions. If you do have questions as we move along, please just let me know. We can always take a minute and address some of the issues. For our morning session, our focus is going to be on the historical development of the European Union. In the afternoon, we'll be looking a little bit more specifically at the treaty. We'll talk a little bit about treaties in the morning, and then a little bit more about the policy-making process in the afternoon. And we're going to address this morning the basic functions of the main European Union institutions. So I like to always start usually my either European politics classes or talks about the EU with this quote from Madeleine Albright, who said, "To understand Europe, you have to be a genius or French." And you'll see a little bit as we move along that the EU itself is a very complex institution, and in looking at the evolution of the EU, there are significant changes over time, sometimes changes in the language that's used to name particular policymaking processes, shifts in the power of the different institutions. So it brings me to my next slide. When we're talking about how the EU works, really the answer is it depends. And it depends on what time period you're studying, what policy domain you're looking at an international context, how the EU might work. Before the workshop started, I was speaking with one of our participants about the foreign policy, the common security and foreign policy of the EU, and how it's much less developed compared to some other policy areas, and then also national context. So my research, which Professor Altenstetter mentioned, looks more specifically at France as a member state and the role that France plays not only in the EU, but how EU law affects French domestic policies as well. So all of these things, like I said, it depends. What questions are you asking about the EU? And then that will be your starting point for understanding how the EU works. So let's take some time to consider some questions for this morning session as we move on. First, what you'll need to know is the historical basis for the European Union, for the founding of the European Union, and how the EU has evolved over time. So just a couple of facts that you should know kind of to show the complexity of the European Union. We now have 28 member states. I gave this talk in March. I was using my old slides. Jocelyn also pointed out to me that I hadn't updated them. In March, it was 27 countries with 23 official languages. Croatia has since fully acceded into the Union, so now we have 28 countries with 24 official languages. And this really has grown over time, right? So the structures of the different institutions, their influence in policy making, the very rules of decision making have been repeatedly modified as we move forward, in part because we're seeing, I don't think I have Croatia on here then either, right? So slightly outdated slide. I'll have to go back and fix this before we post it to the website. But we see the original members, these core members, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy, these 6 founding members, right, sort of at the center of this growing EU. And this evolution over time then is impacted by the accession of new members into the EU and decisions that have to be made. Clearly, if you have more parties at the table in negotiations, this very much changes treaty-making process, policy-making process as well. Let's move on to talking a little bit about the EU institutions. Before we talk specifically about the Council, I'd like to give just a little bit of background about the founding of the European Union. So the European Union as it is today, the seeds of it, or the start of it, really began in the early 1950s with the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, also abbreviated as ECSC. By Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. I forgot Luxembourg when I was discussing the original members a minute ago. So what we're seeing here is a post-World War II response, right? So how do we bring peace to the European continent? How do we prevent wars like World War I and World War II from happening again? And we're talking then about creating either an economic community first, and then along with that, a political community to create clear diplomatic channels and links between these states to hopefully prevent war from happening in the same way. So first, it's this linking of the European coal and steel communities in the early 1950s, and then we see further cooperation coming from that through the 50s and 60s, known as through the Treaties of Rome, as well as the European Economic Community, the EEC that's created, and the European Atomic Energy Community, also known as Euratom, and the Merger Treaty, which is the beginning of streamlining the community's institutions. So all these treaties are putting forward different ways of collaborating or cooperating, and the Merger Treaty was looking at making these institutions run a little more smoothly. Over time, the treaties have been amended, new treaties have been negotiated and passed, sometimes to replace previous treaties. And really what we're looking for, or at least the objective of this treaty making, is to make the European Union more efficient and hopefully more transparent. So if we go back to that original slide where that stick figure is holding up his hands and clearly slightly in distress and trying to understand what's happening, part of the effort by the European institutions is to make the process more transparent to its citizens. Also to prepare for new member countries coming in. So we see changes in the process of decision making when new countries accede, because negotiations will have to be different, and also room at the table will need to be made for these new countries. Over time, we see the creation of a single currency for the majority of the EU states under the European Monetary Union, although not all European Union states are a party to the European Monetary Union. Not all have the euro. But the treaties themselves are the basic rule of law for the European Union, right? They're the binding agreements between the member states, and the treaties are there to set out the objectives, the rules for European Union institutions, and a framework for how decisions should be made, and the relationship between the European Union and its member states. So let's talk a little bit about the institutions that are framed by these states. So let's talk a little bit about the European Council. The European Council is the institution that really sets the agenda for the EU. It began in 1974 as this informal forum for the heads of state or government of the EU member states. Over time, it's become more formalized. It's acquired a full-time president. It sort of receives full institutional status in 1992. And then finally, under the Lisbon Treaty, the European Council becomes one of the 7 major institutions of the European Union. Summit meetings usually occur at least twice a year, although on average they tend to meet 4 times annually. And it convenes on the broad political priorities and major initiatives of what the EU should be looking at, sort of what's on its agenda. In addition to the European Council members and president, the Commission's president and the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy also attend those summit meetings. And in general, the European Council there, like I said, is there to set the agenda. So it's also deals with complex, sensitive issues that cannot be resolved at a lower level of government. So if there are major disagreements between the many member states, the idea is that bringing the heads of government and state together gives them this forum within the summit to deal with some of this. But the European Council has no power to pass laws. We're going to look at other institutions that are responsible for that. It is seen as being an important part of developing the core tasks for the EU. So while no direct power in passing laws, clearly the different heads of government across the European Union have a heavy influence in the direction of the European Union itself. So let's talk a little bit about some of the other institutions that make up the EU, sort of ones that have some more of this direct power. We have what we call the institutional triangle. So the Commission, the Council of the European Union, which is frequently just referred to as the Council, and the European Parliament. Because of now this formalization and institutionalization of some of the other parts of the EU, we now talk about 3+2 in terms of the major EU institutions. So our institutional triangle, and then the Court of Justice and the Central Bank. We're going to focus on the institutional triangle at first. So the institutional triangle is responsible for European Union legislation, so the European Parliament, the EP, the Council, the Commission. Through what's called the ordinary legislative procedure, these institutions are producing the policies and procedures of the European Union. In principle, the legislative powers are separated among the institutions. The Commission is there to propose new laws. The Parliament and the Council are there to adopt them. Then it's the Commission and the member states that are there to implement them. The Commission is also there to oversee and make sure that the laws are properly applied and implemented. So in this way, the Commission is sort of working as an executive in this type of legislation making, so it's sort of this collective executive, and the Parliament and the Council act respectively as a parliamentary chamber and as a collective forum for the member state representatives. Of course, this works a bit differently in practice, right? And as I mentioned in that first slide, it depends on the policy domain that we're talking about. It depends on the time period to see the different influence of these three institutions in legislation making. But let's talk a little bit about the European Parliament. So the European Parliament is our only directly elected body of the European Union. Originally, they were appointed, members of European Parliament were appointed, and then that changes in 1979. So again, if we're looking at time period of decision making in the EU, this is a significant change in the members of Parliament. So studying the European Parliament, the influence and power that it has, we see this shift in 1979 from appointed members to directly elected members. Currently, the total number, let me explain this. The TOL is referring to the Treaty of Lisbon, which is the treaty that's passed in 2009. So the Treaty of Lisbon sets the members of the European Parliament at 754 because we were adding numbers as states exceeded, and then the decision now is to set it at a number, and the percentage will shift over time depending on population of the member states. If we think about the size of the European Union, the European Parliament represents about 500 million people across Europe, right? So the populations of those member states. The members of the European Union, members of the European Parliament are elected once every 5 years. We see pretty low turnout for elections, right? So some of the discussion in the literature about the European Union is what's called this democratic deficit. So this bodies of government that are working to make policies and procedures, and the question of whether or not they're really influenced by the citizenship or whether the citizenship has input. So that is a concern or sometimes a critique of the EU. At the same time, we see that European citizens usually have very low turnout in this opportunity to directly elect members or representatives for their interests at the European Parliament level. As mentioned, the European Parliament has gained some power over time because of changes to the way legislation is happening and decision making within the EU. The European Parliament tends to scrutinize the other EU institutions, especially the Commission. So we see this balance between the Commission and the Parliament. Both are sort of the watchdog for the other to make sure that things are running smoothly. The EP works very closely with the Council in debating and passing European laws, and it also debates and adopts the budget, so that gives it some significant power among the institutional triangles. One thing to mention about the members of the European Parliament, even though there is sort of this low voter turnout, they are representative of state interests in some way, but within the Parliament we begin to see shared affiliations really based along party affiliation rather than among state affiliation. So not all the French members of Parliament stick together necessarily, but rather if there are members there that hail from the Green Party, they tend to vote with Greens from other member states. So we're beginning to see in the European Parliament this organization based on party affiliations among the representatives. Among these party groupings, the European People's Party, a sort of center-right grouping, and the European Socialist, a center-left grouping, are by far the largest and most important in terms of representation within the European Parliament. We have other types of groupings that occur usually along coalitions of liberals, Greens, far right, far left. We have some Eurosceptics, nationalist party affiliations, right? So those are some of the lesser groupings that we may see. This has developed more over time. So this organization based on party lines is more recent in looking at the history of the European Parliament. And so members of Parliament are now more likely to vote along party lines rather than by national ties. Let's talk a little bit about the Council of the European Union. So located in Brussels, the presidency of the Council of Ministers rotates every 6 months to a different head of state. This is something that has changed over time. What we're looking at for the Council is that it's comprised of representatives from the governments of each member state. So in principle and in law, there is only one Council, which is empowered to take decisions on any topic, but its structures are actually more complex than that. So in reality, the Council is made up of ministers from member state governments, but which ministers may be attending meetings depends on the subjects being discussed. As a result, the Council has developed specific formations around different ministerial positions. So economic and financial affairs, transportation, environment, agriculture. And so we see then this sort of complexity within the institutions as well, not only how they deal with one another and their relationship to the EU, but changes over time within the institutions and how that plays out in decision making. Altogether, the permanent representations contain approximately 1,500 national officials, and there's an estimated 250 working groups within the Council. So coming back to that, I keep referring to that original slide. It depends. It depends on policy domain. It depends on time period. It depends on national context in terms of decision making. The Council is charged with several responsibilities. It's supposed to represent the interests of the member states. It's supposed to pass EU laws. It's there to coordinate the broad economic policies of EU member countries. It's there to sign agreements between the EU and other countries, to approve the annual EU budget, which is what the European Parliament votes upon, to develop the European Union's foreign and defense policies, coordinate cooperation between courts and police forces of the member states. The Council mostly negotiates detailed proposals for EU action. And the majority of Council texts, a little over 70% of them, are agreed upon within these working groups. So I mentioned in terms of all the sort of Eurocrats that are involved within the Council, we have organization based on 250 working groups. So the majority of the negotiations are happening in these smaller groups. The Council has played less of a role in policy making in my particular area of research. So I look at agricultural biotechnology, genetically modified organisms. So when I study within my area of research, the Council, while important because it's one of the major institutions, has not had a heavy hand in influencing policy compared to some of the other institutions. For me, when I look into my area of research, studying the Parliament and studying the Commission is much more salient to my topic. But because of the way the decision-making process has happened and some of the blocking states within the European Union, there's been a failure to attain a qualified majority decisions for or against GMO approvals. And so in this way, the Council has had some significant impact by its failure to have a qualified majority to approve or not approve, right? So sort of by inaction, it becomes important. I mentioned a few of the things that the Council is responsible for, so passing, that the Council is responsible for, so passing laws, coordinating economic policies, signing those agreements. Really, the coordination of cooperation is incredibly important in terms of what the Council does. So in terms of this institutional triangle, then we've touched upon the European Parliament, the Council, and then we have the European Union Commission. It consists of 28 commissioners, one for each member state of the EU. The Commission is there to act as the guardian of the treaties, right? So if the treaties, these binding agreements, are the basis for EU legislation and law, the Commission is there to make sure that decisions that are being made, policies that are put forward, directives that are being passed, are really true to what's occurring in the treaties. The commissioners are supported by, it'll be a little bit more with the accession of Croatia, but over 26,000 bureaucrats, and they're divided into departments known as the Directorates General. Commissioners there are to serve 5-year terms. They're supposed to coincide with the parliament, so members of parliament are there for 5 years as well. And these commissioners act as the commission's political leadership, these 28 commissioners. The president of the commission assigns specific policy portfolios, so each commissioner has his or her own portfolio. Foreign affairs, transport, industry, environment. These have multiplied over time as more states have been added. And then we see sometimes the division of particular portfolios to deal with this issue as well. So we may see very close collaboration among some commissioners who are in related or relevant portfolio areas. The European Council nominates the president of the Commission. That nomination is subject to approval of the European Parliament, so a little bit we're seeing the connections between the different institutions. The European Council also appoints the other commissioners in agreement with the nominated president and the member state governments. So although the commissioners are chosen from the individual member states, there's one from every member state that sits on the commission, and they're usually chosen from the upper echelons of politicians, officials from those member states. The commissioners and the president remain accountable to the parliament, which also has the sole power to dismiss the commission. So it's supposed to give them some independence from the member states, that the commissioners are supposed to be there as well to represent the interests of the EU and not necessarily the national interests of their member states. They're supposed to be there to represent the interests of the EU as a whole. What does the EU Commission do? Or sort of the workings of it. Responsible for the day-to-day operation of the European Union. It's really there for overseeing and implementing European Union policies. It proposes new laws to Parliament and the Council. It manages the EU's budget and allocates funding. So we see budgetary responsibilities are split among the institutional triangle. It's the Parliament who gets to approve and pass, the Council who's there to sort of coordinate the economic policies, approve the budget as well. The Commission then there for budgeting and allocating funds. It's there to enforce EU law along with the Court of Justice. So as an example, in my particular issue area, there's a case where the Commission brings France before the European Court of Justice for failure to implement or failure to comply with particular policies about biotechnology. And the Commission also represents the EU at an internationally, for example, by negotiating agreements between the EU and other countries, while the Council is there to sign or ratify. The Commission staff, as I mentioned, is organized into what we call DGs, or these Directorates General. And so these over 20,000 bureaucrats are the ones that are responsible then at a lower level of implementing, following through, checking, making sure that things are going on. Also another, if you're studying the EU, there have been changes in the naming. So the Directorates General used to be by Roman numerals, DG1, DG2, DG3, and then they switched to titles based on the portfolios, so Director Generals of Finance, of Environment, of Agriculture. And so that, if you're looking historically, the titles of these Director Generals have also changed. Professor Altenstetter, who was in here earlier, she had memorized all the Directorate Generals by number. And so when we've had discussions, she sometimes slips into DG9. I'm like, I don't know which one that is. I know by their titles now. Sometimes studying the EU itself, you kind of have to have like a running vocabulary list. So European Union Commission, I mentioned this split in terms of budgeting responsibilities among the institutional triangle. But the Commission, its job there then is to manage that budget, allocate funds. The word I was looking for, I keep using the word bureaucrats, but the DGs themselves are the civil service, right, of the European Union. They're recruited from the member states and sometimes outside the member states. The Commission's power vary across policy domains, although each policy topic is assigned one DG as a chef du file. Many policy areas require coordination among several directorate generals. So again, referencing back to my area of research in agricultural biotechnology policy, for example, I have many different DGs that are at work. So the Environmental Directorate General, the Health and Consumers, known as DG Sanko, Trade, Research and Innovation, Enterprise and Industry. All of these at different points have had an influence in policy making, right? So I think that's 4 or 5 different parts of the Commission then that at different time periods. And over time, we've also seen a shift in where the EU places some of these policies. So for a long time, DG Environmental had the right to essentially propose or put forward new laws to the Parliament and Council. And now that has really shifted to research and enterprise. And that's kind of a different approach then to understanding that issue area and how it's being looked at within the EU. So outside of the institutional triangle, this 3+2, the European Court of Justice and the European Central Bank have become incredibly important. The Court of Justice, its official title is the Court of Justice of the European Union, also known as the European Court of Justice, and is abbreviated the ECJ. It's charged with interpreting EU law to make sure it's applied in the same way in all EU countries. In addition, it settles legal disputes between EU governments and EU institutions. So I mentioned that in my issue area, the Commission has taken France to the ECJ actually twice for non-implementation and non-compliance. And individuals, companies, or organizations can bring cases before the ECJ if an EU institution has violated their rights. So this is very interesting in terms of who has subject status before the law at the European Court of Justice. It's not just member states and institutions who have the right to bring cases before the ECJ, but also those individuals, companies, organizations too. So individuals have subject status, where if we were looking at, say, an intergovernmental organization like the World Trade Organization, only states have subject status under that type of legislation and law. So the ECJ then allows for different subject status, particularly for individuals. EU law takes precedent in the European Union, but only in areas where the EU has declared competency. So where countries have given that power to the European Union. So in the case of biotechnology, the EU has declared competency in this area. That means EU law takes precedence over national law, and that means that if a member state is passing laws that are anti-GMO or preventing the cultivation of GMOs that have been approved at the European level within their domestic territory, then that state is in violation of EU law. This is a lot trickier in practice in terms of getting compliance and implementation to follow through. But the idea is that where the EU has competency, the member states have given up, in a sense, their sovereignty and their national laws have to meet. This, as I've mentioned, varies across policy domain. So some policy domain areas, much less EU legislation than in others, and you would need to understand what the level of competency is in terms of EU law. So at what level might they have intervened? The ECJ includes one justice from each member state, and they in turn are helped by 8 advocate generals who present impartial opinions on the cases brought before the court. The ECJ rules on different types of cases, though usually there's about 5 types that make up the majority of cases heard. So that's requests for a preliminary ruling when national courts ask the ECJ to interpret a point of EU law. So this may happen when an EU directive has been passed or law is being handed down, and national courts would like a better understanding of what actually needs to be done for implementation. Another type of case would be an action for failure to fulfill an obligation. So that's brought against EU governments for not applying EU law. I keep coming back to this biotech case. The Commission goes to the ECJ and says that France is failing to fulfill its obligation for genetically modified organism approvals. It can also look for actions for annulment. So this is against EU laws thought to violate the EU treaties or fundamental rights. So the Commission may say that a directive that's come through or laws that have come through are actually violating principal tenets that are in the treaties themselves, and so the law needs to be annulled. It can be actions for failure to act. So this is against EU institutions for failing to make decisions required of them. And the fifth type of case we tend to see is direct action. So those brought by individuals, companies, or organizations against EU decisions or actions. So I mentioned the biotech case. The ECJ has taken actions against France for France's failure to fulfill obligations in agricultural biotechnology regulation. In these types of cases, it's the Commission or another member state that can begin proceedings. The ECJ then investigates these allegations and passes judgment. Once the ECJ has ruled, if the member state is found to be at fault, the member state is responsible for immediately rectifying that failure. So in the case of biotechnology approvals, the idea was that France was then supposed to open up its regulatory system and either remove the laws that were preventing it from happening. In this case, it was more a de facto ban that had occurred, and allow the approval process to move on. If the ECJ later finds that the offending member state has not followed the ruling, the court may also issue a fine. So this is another way, sort of reparations to get states to fall into line to comply with law. The power of the ECJ seems to be growing. Actually, the power of all really the EU institutions has grown over time, but the ECJ in particular, at first it's kind of envisioned as a very weak institution that will sort of sit in judgment of a few cases that might come up, but it actually has quite a heavy course load. From it, we have the creation of a new court called the Court of First Instance that is supposed to then help alleviate some of the caseload for the ECJ, so the ECJ can take on some of the more major cases. This is sometimes reflected, this growing power that the ECJ has is sometimes reflected in the tension between the court and member states. On the other hand, the Court of Justice has strengthened courts in member states as well. So it's not usurping the power, as it gets more powerful, it's not usurping the power of national courts, but it gives it a new jurisdiction where sometimes national courts are also ruling on EU law. Under the new constitution that had been put out, the ECJ's power would have grown significantly. And so in part, it was to give it sort of to reduce some of that tension, to make it clear the type of power that the ECJ had. Of course, the constitutional treaty does not get passed. The ECJ has established a number of important principles through European case law. So in key cases, in particular, it's firmly established the supremacy of European Union law over the law of the member states in those areas of competence. It also has seen the direct effect of European Union law and national legal orders. And we have what's called it's increased or sort of supported the doctrine of proportionality, and another of non-discrimination on the basis of nationality among nationals of EU member states. So in this way, the ECJ has not only played an important role in policy making, essentially for the compliance and implementation end of policy making, but it's had an important role in the EU's efforts to force member states to comply, or at least to attempt to force member states to comply with EU legislation. The European Central Bank has become another major institution with the proliferation of member states using the euro, right? So the European Monetary Union, which was negotiated in the 1990s and comes into effect sort of digitally or electronically in the late 1990s, and then into physical currency in 2002. So clearly then, having a European central bank and having it be a strong institution has changed with the adoption of the common currency. The ECB is based in Frankfurt, Germany. Its main responsibility is managing the euro, the European Union single currency, and it's supposed to safeguard price stability in the European Union. The ECB is also responsible for framing and implementing the EU's economic and monetary policy. What's different, sort of when we talk about, sometimes my undergraduates like to think of institutions here in the United States and they try and connect. So the ECJ is like the Supreme Court and the Commission is like the executive, and that can be a very difficult comparison to make. So sort of broad strokes, it may work to give a general understanding if the American case or the American system is sort of the knowledge you have to try and make some connections. But there are so many differences that it can lead to some confusion. In the case of the European Central Bank, it's important to note some of the differences between that and, say, the Federal Treasury here in the United States and the responsibilities that they have. For one, the European Central Bank, while responsible for framing and implementing the European Union's economic and monetary policy, so things like how much currency will be printed versus how much currency may be taken out of the system, individual member states still have their own fiscal policies. And what we also see is that the European Central Bank does not have the right to impose taxes. And so, tax rates across the member states can remain different. So there is the VAT tax that does exist. But we sort of see this two-level then of governance in terms of economic and monetary issues that create some of the problems in terms, we have difficulties sometimes in coordination here in the United States, but creating some of the problems. So individual member states still have some control, particularly over their fiscal policies. So the European Central Bank, one of the major 5 EU institutions, main purpose to keep prices stable, meaning trying to keep inflation under control, especially in the countries that use the euro, so now the majority of the member states, but also to keep the financial system stable. And that means making sure financial markets and institutions are being properly supervised. The bank works with the central banks in all 28 European Union countries, and together those 28 central banks plus the ECB form the European system of central banks. So even in states that do not have not adopted the euro or don't fully have it implemented yet, we see that the European Central Bank is working with those central banks. This leads to close cooperation, in particular with the central banks in the Eurozone. The cooperation between the smaller, tighter group of banks is referred to as the Euro system, right? So all central banks of the EU plus the European Central Bank is that European system of central banks. The Eurozone central banks plus the ECB is known as the Euro system. The European Central Bank's role includes setting key interest rates for the Eurozone, controlling the money supply, as I mentioned, managing the Eurozone's foreign currency reserves, buying it or selling currencies when necessary to keep exchange rates in balance, helping to ensure financial markets and institutions are adequately supervised by the national authorities and the payment system seems to function smoothly within those states, authorizing central banks in Eurozone countries to issue Euro bank notes, and monitoring price trends and assessing the risk they pose to price stability. So if you've been paying attention, it's sort of fallen off the front page in the United States in the last several months, but last year it sort of dominated the headlines, what's happening in Spain, particularly in Greece, Portugal, and a lot of discussion. It might ramp back up with Angela Merkel's recent win again as president in Germany. So we might see more of this discussion back in the American news, but if you're studying Europe, sort of the role that the ECB was playing along with the IMF and the World Bank in austerity policies across Southern Europe, across Europe in general, this is where that power comes from. So why is the ECB right there? And it's because they have the legal authority within Eurozone states. The ECB has several decision-making bodies, the executive board, which is there to oversee the day-to-day management, the governing council, which is there to define Eurozone monetary policy and fix interest rates at which commercial banks can obtain money from the bank, and the general council, which is contributing to the ECB's advisory and coordination work and is there also to help prepare new countries that are joining for adopting the euro. So those are sort of the three main parts of the ECB. The ECB is supposed to be completely independent. Neither the ECB, the national central banks in the euro system, nor any member of their decision-making bodies can ask for or accept instructions from any other body. All EU institutions and governments must also respect this principle. Of course, we see in the discussions that are being had, critiques of the ECB, really how independent is it? And in particular, there's a lot of discussion over the relationship between what Germany wants and how that's being pushed forward through the ECB, related to the fact that the ECB is located in Germany, and that was a purposeful decision to make sure that Germany was on board in adopting the current common currency. So I mentioned at the beginning that the roots of the European Union are planted in the early 1950s with the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, so Belgium, France, Germany, Italy, Luxembourg, which I had forgotten the first go-around, and the Netherlands. And then this is further codified, institutionalized, the cooperation between the founding states and the treaties from the late 1950s and the 1960s. So we have our Treaties of Rome, which create the European Economic Community, the EEC, and the European Atomic Energy Community, and the Merger Treaty. And I mentioned that these treaties are then the basis of the rule of law in the European Union. And the EU has amended, created new treaties, sometimes replaced its treaties in order to become more efficient and transparent, to prepare for new member countries, and to introduce new areas of cooperation, such as the euro or the single currency. So every action taken by the EU is founded then in these treaties and has been approved voluntarily and democratically by all EU member countries through this treaty-making process. In 1987, we have the Single European Act, also sometimes labeled the SEA, which comes into force in 1987, and it's the first major revision to this set of treaties, the Rome Treaties in particular. So its main purpose was to reform EU institutions in preparation for Portugal and Spain's membership, but also to speed up the decision-making process in preparation for the creation of the single market. The SEA had a significant impact on voting procedures in the European Union's decision-making, and it expanded the areas of use for qualified majority voting, or QMV, in the Council to cover more policy domains. And this was in that attempt to speed up or make more efficient the process. It was to move from a more unanimous approach to the QMV approach. To do this, the treaty also gave more power to the European Parliament, and it changed those voting procedures in the Council. It created a citizens' initiative, a permanent president of the European Council, a new high representative for foreign affairs, and a new EU diplomatic service. In 2009, with the Treaty of Lisbon, we have a clarification of what's known as the subsidiarity principle, which is really important for policymaking and the treaties that are laid out by the European Union. So subsidiarity is the idea that decisions are supposed to be taken as closely as possible to the citizen as allowed, and that constant checks are being made to verify that action at the European Union level is justified in light of the possibilities available at national, regional, or local levels. So I mentioned earlier this idea of the levels or areas of competence where the European Union law is supreme to national law. And the idea is that the EU shouldn't be taking over in terms of policy areas if law would be more efficiently made at that national, regional, or local level. So subsidiarity then is the idea that the EU doesn't have to be involved just to be there, but rather that there's some benefit or belief that it'll be a more efficient process if the EU were to step in and take over in an area of competence. So this is a thread throughout all EU treaties, but again, clarified in the Treaty of Lisbon. The Treaty of Lisbon then requires that the principle of subsidiarity very clearly lays out that it should be respected in all draft legislative acts, and it also allows national parliaments to object to a proposal on the ground that it breaches the principle. So national governments can say it is not appropriate for the EU to take this area of competence. It would be better for the member states to deal with this issue. So from this basis, in terms of those treaties, the decisions of where the EU has competence, where national member states should be taking the lead in terms of decision making, we sort of have a standard policy making system that comes out of it. And it comes out from these treaties in the late 1950s, the creation of the European Economic Community, or the EEC. So the basic working model, or the standard model that was set out in the EEC treaty, was that the Commission should propose legislation, the Parliament would advise on that legislation on a restricted range of matters, so matters that were determined to be more important to a general populace, and that the Council then decides at the time, the way it was set out in this treaty, by a unanimous decision. Right, so we see that I mentioned the Single European Act as one of the first major reforms to move it to this qualified majority voting. The court was then there to adjudicate in any instances where there was disagreement, either about the law itself and whether or not that legislation matched the principles of the treaties, but also an application. But this has really evolved over time, right? So again, coming back to how does the EU work? It depends. The system now, we see a great number of different policy and decision-making processes. So your area of interest, it will make a difference in terms of how decisions are made. How decisions are made, or the processes that exist for monetary issues, very, very different than who's involved, who has influence and power in my issue area of agricultural biotechnology. What we see is a mixture of intergovernmentalism and supranationalism. The idea of intergovernmentalism is this working among the member states and their interest, right? So the governments of the different member states, and having a balance really with power still vested in the member states themselves, but those member states making decisions both in their national interest and in the good for the of the EU. Supranationalism then is the creation of institutions sort of above and beyond the power of the individual member states. Member states clearly still have the ability to input. The Commission example is an example of a supranational institution, and that these decisions then are being made at the EU level by EU institutions for the good of the EU. Right, so we're trying to strike this balance. In some policy areas, member state governments still have a greater influence and push for more national interest. In other areas, supranationalist institutions, EU interests become sort of prime or supreme. And the balance is being constantly disputed, right? So in some issue areas it can be very contentious still. In other issue areas the EU may have clearly taken the lead, whereas we may see more of an intergovernmental approach in other places. When we look at the EU, we have this multi-actor character or flavor to the European Union. So we have European Union institutions that are at play, national actors that are at work. We were talking over lunch about some of these subnational movements, localities or actors that may be involved, and different interests then at all of these levels. So formal roles, powers of actors can vary between policy areas. The EU is multi-level in nature, right? We have levels of European Union institutions, national and subnational institutions, and the relationship among these institutions can vary. So it's not just how the EU works with national institutions and then how they in turn work with subnational. Subnational institutions may go directly to the European Union and vice versa, right? So all different sorts of links between these levels. We also call the European Union multi-speed. And what we mean by this is that different members of the European Union have been integrated differently So if we go back to that map I showed in the morning session, the levels of enlargement and succession or accession into the Union that we see, some can move and exceed much more quickly because they're in a better economic situation. Their national legislation looks a lot more like EU laws that are already existing, so they have fewer tweaks or legislation to make to meet EU standards. Other states are on a slower process to get up to speed. And we have this increasingly differentiated character with the enlargements, right? So starting out with this core group of Western European states, while very different in terms of culture, history, even democratic structure, still had a sort of set of basic values, interests, and geography that they were working with. And then this has changed over time. If we think back to that figure I gave you, that the European Parliament is responsible for over 500 million people, or representative of 500 million people within that area, it kind of gives you the idea of this differentiated character across the European Union. So how can we make sense of this complexity, particularly within the policy making process? So one is being sure that you're familiar with your particular issue area that you're interested in, right, and sort of digging deep into it. But we have 3 basic criteria that help us distinguish between, but also to identify the persistence of distinct policymaking patterns. So over time, we see that there are particular ways of policymaking that frequently appear. One thing to look at would be the degree of involvement in institutions that are independent of government, right? So what other actors are involved? Are they subnational independence movements maybe that have a heavy influence? Could it be corporations that might be involved, women's movements, environmental groups? A second is looking at the decision-making rules in the council. So I've mentioned that over time, the institutions themselves have evolved in different ways. So at different time periods, particularly if you're looking at earlier time periods where a unanimous decision was needed to move forward versus this qualified majority vote, how might that influence the policy-making process? And then the legal character of decisional outcomes. So what is being put forward? Is it a binding piece of legislation? Is it a directive? Is it a suggestion of how member states should implement? How in detail is that directive written? So sometimes there can be a wide range of action that can be taken by a member state to meet the criteria of fulfilling a directive. Sometimes they're much more specific. So what sort of decision is put forward, and how does that make a difference for implementation by the member states? So when we look at these 3 criteria and how they're related, we usually see 5 broad policy processes that result. So the 5 main processes we're going to look at today, we're going to start with the classic community method. This is seen as based on that institutional triangle, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament. The Commission formally takes the policy lead in proposing legislation. Depending on the issue area, we've seen this enlarged over time. More and more policy domains are being decided by qualified majority voting rather than a unanimous decision. So usually it's QMV is available in the Council. And areas in which the European Parliament has the power of co-decision on some of this legislation making. So the European Parliament also has shifted over time to gain more policy areas in which they have the power of co-decision. So where law is being made, of course, we have of those others sort of the 3+2, the outside institution, the ECJ has jurisdiction over those decisional outcomes. So when we look at the EU's lawmaking procedure, we have the European Council sort of sitting outside, right? They're setting kind of the broad tone for what the EU is working on, sort of setting the main objectives of the agenda. The Court of Justice there to adjudicate and when necessary or to give preliminary rulings about how member states should implement. But it's the Commission that then is putting forward proposals for legislation. Political and significant legislation tend to go first, European Parliament, Council of Ministers. More administrative legislation, sort of the rules, how the EU works, going towards the committees, right? So is it an issue of management administration, regulatory, advisory, direct action. And we see then that legislation is adopted in one of three forms. So directives, regulations, or decisions. And this is, again, all under this, the classic, what's known as the classic community method. The next method is the EU regulatory mode. In this case, the Commission is positioned as sort of known as the architect and defender of regulatory objectives and rules, so things like economic criteria. The Council acts as a forum for agreeing upon minimum standards and the direction of harmonization. The ECJ acts as the works as the means of ensuring rules are applied evenly. They're backed by the national courts. The Parliament is a way to prompt consideration of non-economic factors. So they're kind of overseeing, making sure things like environmental concerns or regional concerns, sometimes gender concerns, are being addressed. So over time, particularly within environmental issues and gender issues, these principles or ideas have been what's called mainstreamed, and so for each, whenever legislation is put forward or proposed, the idea is that all actors have to consider what potential impact this may have for environmental issues, for gender issues, particularly with economic legislation that might be put forward. And then we have the regulatory agencies that are usually responsible, an agency like the European Food Safety Authority for overseeing, consulting, being asked to test or step in and give some feedback. The regulatory mode has become very prominent as a decision-making or policy-making procedure, in part because what we're looking at in terms of these regulations are things that member states have to implement, but the process tends to be more effective in the sense that it's quicker, and the community, the different institutions that are involved are usually able to move that policy forward through the winding process more quickly, more efficiently, and get that input they need. So this has become I'm blanking on his first name. Majone, have you guys read The Regulatory State? So if you're familiar with, if you're studying EU development, but also EU legislation, Majone has an article or a chapter that looks at the regulatory state, so how the EU over time has become, the regulatory mode has become sort of one of the main decision-making processes, and why, and essentially it's sort of lower hurdles to get over in order to get legislation put through. Our third policy-making type is what's called the EU distributional mode. In this case, the Commission is taking the role of attempting to devise programs. They partner with local and regional authorities to get these programs implemented or to get feedback to develop these programs. Member governments in the Council then are bargaining over the budget, and in particular because there's usually some redistributive element, right? So taking monies from the different member states and then determining who is getting these monies, and particularly what programs. There's usually some additional pressure from the Parliament, right, to make sure that, again, the process is being followed appropriately, to prompt for non-economic factors to be looked at, things like gender, the environment, regional issues, and that local and regional governments benefit from some policy empowerment. So coming back to the point I made earlier, when we're looking at the different levels of governance within the EU, when we look at how the EU may engage with localities or regional governments, provincial governments, rather than directly with the national government, assuming then that the national government will deal with subnational levels of government. This is one of those areas where the EU may deal directly with local and regional authorities. And so they get some policy empowerment from this. They don't have to worry about going through their own national government or waiting for monies to be dispersed through the national government. They can go directly to the EU, or the EU may come directly to them to provide for programs. Over lunch, I was speaking with someone about support for language programs to maintain regional dialects. So funds that may be provided for providing classes. We were talking about Provençal in France, Catalan as a language, Breton as another language in France. So that this is then monies coming from the EU to support those programs that do not pass at all through the French national government. Our next or fourth mode is through policy coordination. And so what we see here is that not all policies are originally created at the EU level. There may be some similar policies existing in almost all member states. But in this case then, the EU can help act as a coordinator to streamline or get those policies to look similar or more similar to one another. So in this case then, the Commission is acting as a developer of networks, talking to experts or stakeholders, making technical arguments to promote modernization. Independent experts then have, this is sort of the first time we're seeing them in these different types of policy-making processes. Independent experts work as a promoter of ideas. So going to the EU and saying, you know, Germany has this particular sort of innovation policy, and France has something similar, so does Belgium, et cetera. And what we need is a more streamlined approach. So the Commission needs to come in and help streamline or coordinate the way this is approached by the different national governments. So we see that experts, or these high-level experts, have more influence in this sort of policy-making process. The Commission may convene then groups of these high-level experts, the Council may convene groups of these high-level experts to consult and provide information. In the public policy world, we talk about this as either peer pressure, policy learning, benchmarking, yes, question? So benchmarking is providing sort of goals, what's the word? I want to use the word benchmark. Providing, okay, let me give an example. Oh, so through the EU, so the Commission, the Council, they come through, and let me give an environmental example. Say this is hypothetical, say we're talking about carbon emissions, right? The Northern European states tend to have more stringent environmental protections and policies, and so experts will come to the Commission and say, you know, we sort of have these leader states in the north that have these policies in place to reduce CO2 emissions by 10% by 2015. We'd like to see something similar in other states. So through this peer pressure, or why can't we do it like the way Sweden's doing it, something like that. And so the Council then may come back and say to southern states, sometimes states that are not these leader states we might call laggard states, and say, we're setting a benchmark. We would also like you to reduce CO2 emissions by 10%, but rather than meeting where Sweden's already at, say by 2025, right? So setting goals or objectives.
So what happens when Athens, for example, doesn't do that?
Well, it depends on the type of decision that's come through. Right, so is it, usually benchmarks are non-binding agreements. They're more hopeful objectives, goals to be reached that for the betterment of the European community, but because of economic issues, industry standards, it may take a while for them to meet that.
So what, I mean, is there now a literature developing on the phenomenon of the missed benchmark? Like it must be increasingly...
More so on policy learning and this leader versus laggard state. So particularly in the issues of environmental policy, sometimes we were talking over lunch about gender issues as well, some states being further along in providing equal rights, equal protections for women under the law, human rights issues, so more social, what are considered more social policies. And so then if we look at this last point that's up here, what do those outputs look like? This is more of the soft law, declarations instead of that binding hard law. So what happens if you don't do it? Well, there could be peer pressure, there could be nudging by other states, but there's not the same sort of legal repercussions that are available through non-compliance procedures. You're not going to be brought before the ECJ by the Commission. But the idea is that through this peer pressure, you'll, instead of a race to the bottom, member states will raise their policies towards the top.
And does it work?
It can work, but it also depends on the particular issue, economic climate, and then the individual member state. So, for example, if you're a country like Greece that's struggling right now with things like unemployment and inflation, your environmental resources that are going towards environmental protections and policies may have diminished significantly. And that's another reason why they tend to be more soft law in these issue areas. But usually benchmarks are set out for these types of policy areas rather than economic policy. So there may be stated goals or objectives that are put out there. So we're hoping to get inflation down by a particular %, but not in the same way that we're talking about here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand. I can imagine some issues in which nobody ever meets the benchmarks. You know, where the leader countries that do, but everybody else is just, you know, that sounds nice, but we're not doing it.
Right. Usually, though, it's put into a larger context. That it's so say under the Treaty of Lisbon, you're talking about environmental protections. That this is part of a bigger piece, things that the EU wants to see accomplished over a longer amount of time, and so it's not just these one-offs. We want to reduce carbon emissions, or we want to do this, but it's a why is this good? Usually it's couched in economic terms. The cost of environmental degradation will outweigh the short-run benefits of, you know, emitting this amount of CO2, right? So sometimes there are...
Policy learning, is that one of the ways that one tries to get towards?
So policy learning, what we're talking about here is the idea that when a policy needs to be, when a problem is identified, and the idea then is that government needs to respond to it in order to find a solution, instead of reinventing the wheel and starting from scratch, looking at member states or even outside of the EU, countries that have successfully solved a problem or have policies in place that seem to be successfully solving a problem as learning models. So what could we do here in the EU? So Sweden has a very good model, or Germany or Spain. What they're doing domestically might be something that we would be able to implement across the EU itself, right? Instead of saying, you know, essentially it's doing a little research. And it's not always positive, so it's also looking at what has failed in other places as a learning experience. So when we talk about policy coordination, it's a lot of what we call this nudging, peer pressure to meet standards that already exist in a number of member states that experts really perceive as being positive, right, and would like to see other member states get on board. Usually, though, in these more, like I said, social type policies, and the outputs then not binding, right, but as encouraging. Because your sort of sense is right. Benchmarks may be set and then not met, but what they're hoping to do is encourage at least effort toward that benchmark as a way to encourage member states to at least try, versus setting a law that states know they will not be able to comply with, right? So giving sort of that flexibility to at least motivate an effort in the right direction. The fifth type of policy process is intensive transgovernmentalism. So this type, a very active European Council is setting the overall direction of the policy. And if we go back to looking at the European Council, we're seeing heads of state and government, right, that are involved. We see the predominance of the Council of Ministers in consolidating cooperation. So if we're coming back to that definition, what is intergovernmentalism? We see the primacy of the member states themselves in decision-making versus the supranational EU institutions. In the intensive transgovernmentalism, it's really the member states working together, right? The high-level officials within those member states on the Council, European Council, in the Council of Ministers. This means a more limited or marginal role for the Commission. The ECJ is not really involved. The European Parliament is not really involved. Essentially, it's a summit of the leaders of the European governments and engagement with specific national policymakers. This process is usually not very transparent. Right? Just like we have what's going on with the UN right now, and we were talking about whether or not Obama was going to meet with the new president of Iran. That would be a closed-door meeting, although both would come back and report what would have been said there. That's the sort of types of meetings that are occurring when this happens. The heads of government are sitting down behind closed doors and talking about particular issues. So it's not transparent to national parliaments, it's not transparent to other EU institutions necessarily, it's not transparent to citizens, but the positive side of this is the capacity to deliver substantive joint policy. This is on occasion that this happens, right? Usually it's something something very specific that's come up, usually a foreign policy issue. And the reason why we see this is the foreign policy pillar of the European Union is weaker compared to some of the other two pillars. And really this is sometimes in response to war that's occurring. So whether or not all the member states are on board about what to do with Syria, they're not. But really then it's when the member state governments sit down and talk about it. The heads, presidents, prime ministers, defense ministers, whoever might be involved in that process. So when we talk about the EU, there's been some discussion in the news lately about sort of where is the EU going, right? Really, maybe not from its inception, but if we look at some of the member states, we see movements within them to remove those states from the EU. I study France specifically, and the far right very frequently calls for, if the far right wins the presidency, they will immediately renounce their membership in the EU and stop the use of the euro as a currency, et cetera, et cetera. This has been sort of kind of an underlying tension in some member states, but a question of what will happen to the EU has been much more salient for us in the last few years because of the economic crisis. So concerns about what will happen within the EU with some of these southern states doing very poorly economically, what's happening with Greece, and then questions about what the future of the EU may look like if some of these states fail. So what are some of the issues at hand here? There's institutional tensions. With each enlargement and with each accession, we're seeing now more member states at the negotiating table, more members being added, and the process itself becoming more complex. Concerns also about the balance of power within it, right? So who's being represented? Do they have enough representation within EU institutions? We're also looking at issues of integration, so adding more states into the Union, but are they truly being economically integrated into the Union? Are they on the path to adopt the euro in a certain amount of time? This is where we see that multi-speed character. Some states will be better positioned for adoption earlier rather than later. This third point, which I sort of mentioned at the beginning, the European Monetary Union and the economic crisis. So what will occur with that? And then once, let's say that Greece is set on the right path through these austerity measures, we see reductions in unemployment in Spain, we see reductions in inflation, we see the economy turn around and Europe experiencing growth again. What may be done moving forward to prevent something like that happening in the future? We have enlargement, so Croatia recently joined, but on the path to membership we have Turkey. Turkey's been on the path to membership for a very, very long time, and probably will be for a very long time. Macedonia, Iceland. So what to do as the EU continues to enlarge? Professor Altenstetter mentioned in the beginning that it depends on how you define Europe. Is it 45 states? Is it 47 states? Who do you count within that? And then also what that means for the makeup of the EU itself. So concerns about differences in culture or history. One of the main issues with Turkey is concerns about religion, right? And how does that fit within sort of the larger vision of the European Union? The European Economic Community is essentially a free trade zone. So there's the free movement of goods, services, and people within the Union. That means that we've drastically reduced or eliminated tariffs and taxes, that you have access to markets, resources and goods, and that those things should be cheaper then, that you have a market for your own domestic goods. And this also extends, so I mentioned the free movement of people. There's been an effort to create something of a European citizenship. So, for example, if you're a French individual and you want to work in England, you're working in London, there's actually a significant French expat community in London working in finance. You can go and work there, and as a member of the EU, you can participate in local elections. So you have some direct democratic input into sort of the lowest level of government, the closest level of government to you. You can't vote in, you know, parliamentary elections in England, but you can vote in local elections. So the type of sort of citizenship benefits that are available means you have some say in the governance over yourself. You can still, of course, vote for your members of parliament as well. You can vote back in your home national elections still, just like if you were traveling in the United States, you could do your absentee ballot here. One of the reasons why Turkey's pathway to potential membership is so long compared to other states is this slow process in meeting the democratic standards. It's not just economic, but it's democratic standards that are laid out by the European Union. Concerns about women's rights, concerns about religious rights, concerns about political rights within the country are all some of the obstacles that are preventing Turkey from being closer to putting itself forward for full membership. In addition, there's also criticism of the EU and that this process is so slow because on the flip side, the European Union is dragging its feet because they don't know what to do with a Muslim country as part of the EU. The belief was that, yes, they were making significant strides to a more democratic country until in the last 5 to 7 years, when the political party that's currently in power, there's concerns that they're backsliding, that it's not, that the separation of church, well, not church and state, but religion and state is not as strong as it used to be, that Islamists have more power within the government, that they're incorporating elements of Islamic law, which would not be allowed if they wanted to accede into the Union, and that the belief was that Turkey was moving forward for a very long time towards meeting the democratic standards as outlined by the EU, but that the more recent administration there has moved it back. And so that's a concern, right? But there are those standards in place that, you know, just because a goal may have been met, it needs to continuously be met. It's not just, okay, we've checked this box and moved on. It's a continuous, do women have rights? Also, within the EU member states are not allowed to implement the death penalty. So that needs to be removed. There are particular human rights protections that not only need to be clearly in national legislation, but actually implemented and observed. So these are some of the elements that prevent Turkey from being, from having a shorter pathway to membership, and particularly in the last, like I said, 5 to 7 years, the belief that they've even taken some steps back away from where they were, right? But what would be the benefit to having Turkey in the Union? It's a significant market, a big population, and doing economically pretty well, and it might bolster the European economy. One of the criticisms, as I mentioned, why is the EU dragging its feet? I said they're not unsure what to do with a Muslim country. There is, particularly by the far-right movements that exist in most, if not all, of the European Union states, there's the concern that Muslims across the European Union would form a voting bloc, right? That Muslims in Germany, Muslims in France, Muslims in the UK, all those Muslims in Turkey would then vote based on religious basis and then undermine all the democratic principles of the EU, which we're also talking about very different types of populations, right? Muslims in France tend to come from North Africa. Muslims in the UK tend to come from Pakistan. Muslims in Germany tend to come from Turkey, but they don't all necessarily have the same interests, needs, outlook. But that is one of, these far-right, more nationalist movements, the ones that also talk about removing their states from the EU, sort of what they talk about. Does that answer your question? So what some of the benefits? Let's talk, since you raised the question of benefits, concerns about, certainly not everyone is pro-EU or pro-EU membership. I mentioned these far-right parties. Some concerns about the negatives are really, it's a loss of sovereignty, right? That we're allowing these EU institutions to make decisions further away from citizens, concerns about the democratic deficit. That some of the more powerful EU institutions, they're not directly elected. So, your prime minister is not directly elected. You will directly elect members of parliament, and then your prime minister is selected from among them, and then it's your prime minister that pushes particular policies, depending on the type of system you have in your country. In France, your president is directly elected, right? So the idea is that the counter argument is that the heads of state and government that make up the EU institutions, or that have power within these EU institutions, have been selected by their own people through some sort of democratic process. So maybe they weren't directly appointed to the council, but you voted for them at home, right? Because you believe that they represent your interests there. But that's one of the critiques. So a loss of sovereignty, EU competence in some areas, which means potentially you're following laws that you wouldn't necessarily have selected within your home state, and then concerns about this democratic deficit. Does anyone else have questions? Yes, Tara.
Once you're in the union, can you get out?
So technically, yes. I mean, these far-right movements, if they were to ever get, in power, the movements I'm talking about within these states usually win less than 10% of the vote. They're minority movements in the sense that they do not gain a majority within national elections. But because of how these countries have so integrated their sort of political policy processes and their economic, really it's their economic integration, it would be very, very difficult for them to remove themselves. Maybe for states that have recently joined, have not yet adopted the euro, but the far-right party, the Front National in France, very vocally anti-EU. France has been a member of the European Union since the 1950s. They're one of the founding members. To undo the sort of the intricacy of all the integration that has occurred would be impossible. So it would be, it's not really a viable strategy. Right. I would make that argument. I'm sure there's scholarship out there that says it could be possible, you know, but that what they have in terms of economic integration, access to markets, ability to have, you know, French expats working in the finance industry in London in the way that they do, all of those things, if that is removed, and the process of it would be very, very damaging. Very, very damaging. If we think about this comparison to the United States that you were saying, if you think about in your everyday sort of life, the types of policies that maybe affect you more directly are more local. So if you live in the city, it's, you know, transportation policies, tax policies, that sort of thing. So what would have an impact on your everyday? But this point, this data point that's made within the readings, that 80% of economic policies or influence is at the EU level, I think actually speaks to how the EU is more predominant in a European's life than, say, our federal government may be in an American's life, if we were to go with that, say, split, right? And that's because really economic policies, in my mind, underlie so very much that the creation of this free market zone, if you're a European, the ability to carry an EU passport, to move freely among member states, to engage in trade and business practices across member states, where all of that is being regulated at the EU level. The ability to participate in government at that level by in the direct elections for parliament, and also the way the policies have impacted. So within European Union studies, there's a discussion of a theory called neo-functionalism, or a discussion of spillover. And the idea is that you start with economic policies, but you know, in integrating economically, you need political coordination, and then those integration of economic policies spills over into other issue areas. So, for example, at lunch we were discussing feminism as an issue, and how when the feminist cause seems to make strides, it's not necessarily because feminists have been vocal enough or protested enough, but rather an economic benefit is seen from this thing. So I mentioned a case in which the Equal Pay for Equal Work Directive was passed at the EU level, requiring governments to implement and make sure that women were paid equally for work they did the same as men. Now, this wasn't because NGOs or women's groups you know, had a leader state, the case was France, where this was true, and then they were like, women should have the same equal rights everywhere. The French government actually pushed for it at the EU level because they were worried that industry would leave to go to other states where they could pay women more cheaply. So it wasn't about making sure that women were equally protected. It was about ensuring economic interest and industry standard. And so while it may say in the everyday life, 80% is determined by, you know, state government, that may be true. But this spillover means that I would say a majority of what happens is EU influenced, right? And there's also a specific element of the literature that looks at how this integration has then led to particular policymaking processes at the national level changing as well, that as you're now determining national policy, you're thinking, is this going to be challenged at the EU? Is this going to be a concern to other member states? So even if it's a decision being made at the national level, you can't unembed the European context. So I'd be interested to go back and look and see if they give a description of how they came up with those numbers, because I think it'd be very difficult to say that the EU hasn't influenced in a lot of different ways. So maybe something like security policy at home, police forces, things like that. And yeah, so again, the Europeanization of what happens nationally, this sort of embedded context, it very significant in terms of how institutions act at home, right? So again, sort of in the background, what will this mean in the context of the EU? But the EU also becomes very frequently a scapegoat. So it's important as well to understand what actually comes down through the EU, because it also gets to a point where states will say, I know you really don't like this, but the EU is making us do it. And that can also lead to levels of mistrust, tension, or anger towards EU institutions, because then citizens feel like they don't have any say in what's happening to them. As sort of this, external, shadowy figure is making them do it. Well, yes, in part, but part of that is also member states have been involved. And that was an area of an issue within my own research, where I was wondering, the EU in some ways was forcing France to allow for genetically modified organisms, but France did not follow through and then blame it on the EU. So sometimes states take the opportunity to implement policies because they have the ability to scapegoat the EU, but not always. Not always. So sometimes they do take sort of this nationalist stand and say, well, we'll continue to pay the fines because domestically this is so unpopular, we will not move forward with it. That's very rare. It has happened in a few cases, but very rare. Tara, did you have another question? So we have a few minutes left. Jocelyn will be coming back in at the very end of the session. We'll be doing a short survey just to get some feedback about how the session went. But I'd like to take just the last few minutes to talk a little bit. So we talked very sort of broadly, broad strokes about the institutions, about the policymaking process, but to talk a little bit about the horse meat scandal that happened in the spring as sort of an example of policies at work. So besides looking at biotechnology regulation, so specifically environmental concerns, public health concerns, part of my research is looking at food safety issues. So food safety as a policy domain. Food safety as a policy domain is a fairly recent area of competence for the European Union. So I mentioned when I discussed the European Food Safety Authority, just at the end of the morning session, I said we come back to it. It's not really until 2001 that this reaches an EU level. And that's in reaction to, in part, the mad cow crisis. Is everyone familiar with the mad cow crisis, more or less? I'll just take a minute to sort of recap. So it becomes clear in the mid-1990s that humans have been sickened. First, they are seeing a new disease in animals, particularly in cattle in the UK. And it's something that scientists, farmers are unfamiliar with. And it seems related to a disease that's called scrappy, a sort of degenerative disease that harms the central nervous system of an animal that cannot pass what we call the species barrier. So if you were to eat an animal that had been infected with scrappy, as a human, you yourself would not get sick, right? Although there's a different element to this disease, and they're trying to figure it out. Scrappy itself usually does not affect ruminants or cattle or animals like cows with multiple stomachs, but it affects things like sheep, goats, and some other animals. So they're trying to figure out exactly what's going on. This is happening in the late 1980s into the early 1990s because we're seeing it in animals first. And then around 1996, it becomes clear, between 1996 and 98, but it becomes clear that in fact, humans are also getting sick from having eaten contaminated beef. So unlike this other disease that scientists are familiar with, this can cross the species barrier. People who eat the contaminated parts from these animals will get sick as well. There's a human variant. I don't know if anyone's seen on the news this last week. Someone in New Hampshire was identified as having the human variant of what we would call mad cow disease. And it's similar to Alzheimer's. So usually occurs in the elderly. It is something that builds over time. If you're familiar with Alzheimer's, Alzheimer's is a result of sort of what's called plaques building up within the brain cavity. And so similar to that, it's called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in the human variant, and it's a result of something different, right? Very rare, but it does exist. In this case, mad cow disease was showing up in the young. So, you know, something that essentially had built in over time that we had seen previously in only the very elderly now was affecting teenagers and people in their early 20s. And it was much quicker in terms of degeneration. So usually within a year of the first symptoms, the first physical symptoms, the person who was exhibiting the disease would die. So we see this leads to sort of an element of panic particularly within the UK. So part of my research goes back and looks at how it's being reported on in the news. And I don't know if you, as an example, the Navy Yard shooting from about a week and a half ago, if you were watching the news as it unfolded, there was concerned misinformation about how many people had been killed, how many shooters there were, if they were out in the city, how many guns they had. So when you're looking at the mad cow crisis unfolding, you see sort of similar misinformation being put out. People are still trying to figure out what's happening here. And at the time when people are just beginning to learn of it, estimates were that essentially a whole generation of Britons would be wiped out by this disease. Something over 300,000 people would get sick and die because it was unclear how the disease was passed from animal to person. As it turns out, only very specific materials, what we call high-risk specific materials from the animals, could lead to contamination. So if you were eating bone marrow, if you were eating organs, right, somewhere where the disease would be more highly centered. And in the end, less than 300 people are known to have died from mad cow disease. So we see that initial projection in part caused a panic, although in actuality, it's still very tragic that over 200 people died as a result, but much, much, much significantly less in terms of actual public health impact. This is a main motivator, though, for the EU to begin thinking about food safety, and this is where we see that spillover occurring. With the free movement of goods, services, and people around the European Union, we see a high flow of agricultural products and food products passing across borders in the EU. So food standards and regulations within one state can then have a very significant impact on the population of another state. And so in the early, sort of in reaction to all of this, we have the first wave of mad cow disease in 1996, where predominantly it's animals that are affected, and we begin to hear a case or two of humans. By 2000, it's returned, the second wave of mad cow disease, and then this time, the media is focusing on the human element of it, the people who have been sickened by it. And so by 2001, the EU responds with creating the European Food Safety Authority. And individual member states as well create their own food safety authorities if they didn't already have them, right? To begin, this is where we see policy coordination as a policy process at work. So trying to streamline the different food safety authorities and standards to be met for the European community. So when we talk about something like the horse meat scandal that was in the news in the last, I guess it was 6 months, 7 months ago. It seems forever ago with how quickly stuff falls off the news cycle. But about 6 months ago, this is another instance then to sort of test the common market, right? Does anyone, I know there were a couple articles I had listed, I think. Can anyone give me a short sort of synopsis of what happened? Does anyone remember how it unfolded, who was blamed first, and do you remember? No?
It started in Ireland. There was a lot of scandal. Was it from Romania or from?
So they initially, so very interestingly enough, the finger was first pointed at Romania, and the French were very vocal in saying that it was the Romanians, but in fact it actually came from France. But by the time that was revealed, they had already really moved on. But it fit into a larger context of, you know, these Eastern European states, they've joined, but they're really not up to speed with the rest of us yet. And, but so what happened is they find it first in the UK, in Ireland in particular. What's interesting about it is that there are member states of the EU where horse meat is sold and purchased and cooked, eaten, as it, it's seen as a lesser meat usually, but horse meat itself is not seen as a health threat. Eating horse meat won't make you sick, right? So the concern was not, I ate horse meat, what's going to happen to me? The concern was that people were unknowingly eating horse meat, or that they were eating what they believed to be as beef that had been mixed with not only horse meat but also pork. And so that this was a major concern. How are we testing the food? And so what we see as sort of this example of how the policy process works, it's discovered in Ireland first, and then in the UK, and then the food safety authorities within the member states all begin testing. Meat is pulled from the shelves. The European Food Safety Authority is asked to step in and coordinate the testing and also to run tests of its own, and they begin an investigation as to where this came from. The finger is initially pointed at Romania under the pretense that Romania had just passed a law banning horse and carriage buggies from major roads, and now Romanians had all these extra horses that they didn't know what to do with, right? Sort of this very, like, it's interesting how very quickly sort of nationalist sentiment and stereotypes can take over. But it actually originated, there was discussion of whether or not these were criminal cartels at work.
Yeah, that wasn't true either?
No.
So even the articles you gave us said even Poland or Romania, and never mentioned that it was truly France.
Right. And it's not until during the summer that it comes out that the investigation is complete and it starts in France.
So it's not criminal gangs, it's just a legal company?
It was a legal company that was essentially cutting its meat.
What happened to it?
Well, through the national process, they'll be fined. I'm sure we've had some food safety scandals here in the United States. Those companies usually end up going bankrupt because once the name is out, people stop purchasing their products. They perceive them as unsafe.
So was it found that the horse meat was like causing diseases, or they just didn't want to?
So two things. One, the concern was that consumers were, things were mislabeled and consumers were actually eating products that they weren't aware they were eating. Testing then showed that the horse meat had been adulterated with pharmaceuticals, so that the horses had been given, I think it was a steroid or pharmaceuticals, and there was concern because that pharmaceutical had not been approved for human consumption. So there was no clear understanding that this would harm people, but there was concern that it might. There just wasn't enough information about it. The major issue at hand was, how did this happen, right? How did supposedly a coordinated system allow for untested products? How long might have this gone on, right? Not that the horse meat itself would have made you sick, but if you didn't even know what was in there, how do you know what else is in there? So increased levels of mistrust for the authorities' ability to effectively regulate the food supply. And so when we talk about sort of this spillover, how does the EU get involved into certain areas? How do they expand their areas of competence or authority? Usually it is a result of economic integration first. So the common market that allows for these products to move across the border or to be produced in one country and processed elsewhere and then sent to another company. I mean, IKEA meatballs were found to have them in Sweden, right? So it was not just one place that was affected, but by how very quickly products can be disseminated across the European Union, and then the need for coordination. So I had picked this one because it was somewhat recently in the news, but also as a way to show how, in some ways, how spillover works, right? It starts with economic integration, and then all of a sudden you may ask, why is the European Union involved in food safety regulation? And it's things, sort of a symptom or an after effect of the free market system, excuse me, and the movement of goods across borders. So we see then also the potential for individual state interests all of a sudden rear its head. So finger pointing among the different member states, whose at fault, whose standards are lax, right? Who's not meeting the benchmarks that are being set? And then also a question about who should actually be regulating. So if the law is made at the EU level, who's implementing it? Do the member states have capacity to be testing meat or tracking these sorts of things? Should there be EU regulators that go out and are responsible? So if we go back to the United States versus EU example, we're talking about everyday American versus everyday Europeans' lives. Here we have the FDA, the USDA, regulators that go and test around the country. The Food Safety Modernization Act that Obama passed but has not yet been fully funded also calls for American regulators to visit foreign places of production to test food and check standards to protect the American food supply. So how can that be regulated then within the EU across all these many member states? Does anyone have any questions for me? Yes, Eugene.
Very quick.
Sure.
Does the EU have any power to discipline a member state that doesn't fall into line given the evidence against it?
Yes. Yes and no. It depends, right? It does. So for example, the Commission has brought these cases against France for failure to implement the GMO approval process and allow for cultivation of GMOs that have been approved at the EU level within France. The first round, France actually goes through before the decision is, they're clearly going to lose, and before the decision is finally passed down, France manages to pass it into national law. And so the Commission and the European Union back off. But then moving forward, despite transposing it into law, in practice, there is still a ban. So the law is there, but they're not following sort of the spirit of the law. And the Commission again brings them to the ECJ. And this time France says, okay, we'll really do it this time. And the Commission says, well, we don't really believe you, and so we're going to fine you. I think it was 5 million. I think I know the number in dollars, whatever the equivalent in euro would be. And so the question then is whether or not France follows through and pays those reparations. In some way, it can also work like the WTO. So other states, you can't necessarily get the EU to pay reparations to the United States for trade protectionism. So what the WTO allows is the United States to put in to prevent, products coming in from France or from the EU as a way to gain back what they've lost. So it depends on whether or not member states follow through with paying their fines, which they usually do, but maybe over a long period of time. But there's no other way than sort of the principle of reciprocity. France will follow through and pay its fine because it wants other member states to do it if they're found in non-compliance. There's no other mechanism for extracting that from them. The EU can remove directives that it has in place, replace them or repeal them, if that's the case. In general, though, there have been a number of member states that are non-compliant on this particular issue, and in May of 2010, the Commission actually floated the idea, and it would have been the first time that they had done it, of returning competency to the member states, which was interesting from my point of view. It's my issue area, but also it sets a very dangerous precedent that if non-compliance exists for long enough, maybe the EU will give up. It wound its way through meetings and negotiations and things like that and ultimately failed. They decided against doing it. But in general, interestingly enough, say the UK, for example, can act as a block to a number of directives or treaties or legislation that may go through during the process. But once it passes by qualified majority vote, the UK has a very high level of compliance. So even with laws that it may have disagreed with during the negotiating process, they're willing to accept if it goes through. And so a number of member states are like that as well. So they'll fight it out during the negotiation process, but if it is passed into legislation, they do make the effort to comply. Although again, it depends on issue area. GMOs just happens to be one of those issue areas where member states have really dug in terms of non-compliance. Over time, European citizens have become more educated about the scientific information. They understand better now than they did before about genetics and the potential risks, but that it doesn't change their opinion anymore, in part because it's no longer just about concerns about health, but other social issues. How will this impact farmers? Concern about companies being able to patent and have copyrights on genetic information, the power of multinational corporations in the food supply. So it's no longer just environmental concern or public health concern that people are, they started out with that, I'm worried if I eat this I will get sick. And I don't believe that the government's right. They haven't been right before. They weren't right about beef, right? So then once that kind of is addressed, they're like, well, now I'm worried that Monsanto has too much power. The problem is external pressure from the major biotech producers, Canada, the US, Argentina, through the WTO. So we talked about member states being embedded within the European context. The EU is embedded within the international context, and so why isn't the EU listening to its member states? Well, it's the one that has to deal with paying reparations to the WTO. And that was sort of the motivation for potentially returning the competency. If France wants to not implement, then France should be the one to deal with the WTO. Scientific information might be able to get the biotech producers off the EU's back, but it still wouldn't deal with the domestic issues.